But first tonight, Albanese is lifting in the polls, but he's doing so through untruthful scare campaigns. If the same tactics were used against him, he'd call it misinformation. Donald Trump would call it fake news. Albanese stands in front of the Medicare backdrop day after day. The implication that Peter Dutton would slash Medicare. It's not true, but that doesn't matter to this Prime Minister. As Cameron Milner wrote this week, Albanese is like the used car salesman father in Roald Dahl's book Matilda, making big promises, then winding back the odometer and stuffing sawdust in the gearbox. And when he's caught out, no apologies, only excuses. He can't even admit he's misled Australians on power prices. He promised they'd fall $275 97 times before the last election. Now, obfuscation and deflection.
When will we see our power bills come down?
They are. Well, what we know is that renewables are the cheapest form of power, not because of what we say, but because of what the Australian Energy Market Operator says.
So when do the bills come down?
And what the market is delivering.
All right, just sticking with your plan, Mr Albanese, when will the bills come down?
Under our plan, we know that renewables are the cheapest form of power. Gas is now $13. It was $30.
And when does it get cheaper?
When we came off, 13 is cheaper than 30.
Yet, if the national polls are correct, Albanese is set to win again. And history also tells us this is the most likely outcome. No first-term government has been defeated since the Great Depression. Even after Kevin Rudd's chaotic first term, when he was unceremoniously rolled as Prime Minister by his own colleagues, the coalition couldn't win in 2010. There was a hung parliament, as you'll recall. And it was the election after, when Tony Abbott won in a landslide, only, of course, to then be toppled by Malcolm Turnbull, who wrongly thought he could do it better. So for Dutton to win next Saturday, it would go against the grain of history. The fact he's even in contention reflects just how poor Albanese's record as PM really is. Think of the Voice referendum failure, releasing hundreds of criminal detainees, and some went on to reoffend, issuing nearly 3,000 visas to Gazans from a terror-controlled war zone, abandoning America at the United Nations, refusing to stand up to China after Australian defence personnel were injured or threatened, the Big Australia agenda with 1 million new immigrants, crushing housing supply, the conflicts of interest in the Made in Australia deals, the misinformation legislation that was thankfully scuttled, electricity prices up 32% despite promising the $275 cut, 12 interest rate hikes just to top it all off. No signature reform there, no legacy, just damage. Dutton has put forward major reform, his nuclear policy, gas expansion and greater defence spending. He also wants to embark on major tax reform if he wins government. I mentioned this last night. Dutton wants to index personal income tax brackets so they're in line with inflation. He made the case for this in an interview with the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, and Dennis Shanahan.
I want to see us move as quickly as we can as a country to changes around personal income tax, including indexation, because bracket creep, as we know, is a killer in the economy and it stifles productivity and entrepreneurialism and hard work, etc. But we need to do it at a time where the budget can afford to do so.
This is brilliant policy, much needed reform. Because the issue is that even if wages are growing slightly, bracket creep is pushing workers into higher tax brackets. At the same time, inflation means your purchasing power is shrinking. So look at it this way. Without adjusting the tax thresholds to account for the historic inflation we've experienced, this government has presided over, in effect, a massive tax increase. and it's a tax increase by stealth. Chief economist at the IPA, Adam Crichton, calls this immoral.
The lack of indexation is basically a totally unlegislated tax increase every year. It's completely immoral. And just as the opposition leader just said, you know, it kills entrepreneurialism, it kills productivity. Most serious countries in the world already do this. The United States, France, Canada, Germany. I mean, you know, we index our pensions, we index our family benefits every year, but poor old taxpayer doesn't get any indexation. And that effectively means a tax increase every year. And that is the only way the governments of both persuasions can just keep increasing their spending every year.
Reform in this area is supported by the former head of the Productivity Commission, Michael Brennan, who says it's possible that the ability to raise revenue through bracket creep is on balance, making it easier for the size of government to just grow and for income tax to bear the burden without requiring legislative scrutiny. And highly respected economist Chris Richardson says that the average full-time worker in just 6 years' time will move from the 30% to the 37% tax bracket. He says this wouldn't happen with indexation. He says Australia may be a first world nation, but we increasingly have a third-rate tax system. It last got a spit and polish a quarter of a century ago, with the subsequent neglect leaving it ever more reliant on a handful of increasingly damaging taxes. Now, I asked Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor about this idea of indexing tax thresholds recently, and he didn't rule it out in the future, but said that spending levels and debt were too high to implement right now. But I think most people don't realise that Australia has one of the highest personal income tax rates in the world. The government is just collecting more and more personal income tax to fund their big spending agenda. So reform here is urgent. And I think it's a pity that Dutton didn't announce this policy in his budget reply speech and then campaign hard on it. The coalition campaign should have been bolder and embraced Dutton's own instincts on policy, like on this one. Unfortunately, other members of his team argued against it. So it's not that the coalition doesn't have the ideas, it's that they thought they could win without putting the policy reform on the table. As economics editor at the Fin Review, John Keogh wrote, if Dutton had campaigned on this from the start, he would have given himself a better shot at winning the election. And I agree, especially when you consider Albanese's record. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott used to think 1975 was the most consequential election in our history because Gough Whitlam's government was our worst ever and because voters had to ratify his dismissal. But Abbott says that he believes this election is now more consequential. He writes, because the Albanese government has a worse record of economic vandalism, not just massively expanding the size of government, but also helping to create an unprecedented fall in living standards. What's more, Whitlam seemed like an aberration, whereas the Albanese government is making green left politics the new normal and is basically indifferent to the point of contemptuous of the Anglo-Celtic culture and Judeo-Christian ethic that has made modern Australia so great. Now, in my view, it wouldn't have been the worst idea to draft Abbott into the coalition campaign as a high-level advisor, because the case against the Albanese government is strong, but the messaging needed to be sharper, tougher. And look at these succinct and brutal lines from Abbott in that article in The Australian. He said the fundamental distinction between the government and the opposition's housing policies is that Labor wants to create more renters while the coalition wants to create more owners. And on immigration, Labor's okay with migrants living in Hotel Australia, but the coalition wants everyone to join Team Australia. And he writes that the armed forces are for deterring our potential enemies, not just disaster relief. There's plenty of material for the coalition to work with. And Dutton is, on a daily basis, highlighting the lies of the Labor campaign. And even the media can see it. The country's most experienced newspaper editor, Christopher Dawes, said today that Albanese had run a shameless, outrageous and deceitful campaign. He made the comments right to his face at the West Australian Leadership Breakfast.
On that day, I pointed out that you are conducting a masterful campaign, a masterclass really, built on the maybe Graham Richardson, whatever it takes approach to victory, dabbling in a little bit of deceit, cycling through the spin, unrelenting, uncompromising, at times a little bit outrageous, but a brilliant campaign so far. You are prepared. You never leave home without your Medicare card. You are confident, so much so you let Chris Bowen speak publicly. And you are shameless.
If Albanese wasn't too sure about those lines, well, his smile got tighter and tighter, and the next made him visibly squirm.
While you don't even know the name of the Greens candidate in your seat this time around, it wasn't always the way. If it were not for the Save Our Albo campaign we ran in 2016 while I was editing the Daily Telegraph in your hometown, you would have most likely lost your seat in Parliament to a Green opponent. To this day, Bill Shorten and Tanya Plibersek have never forgiven me.
Bill Shorten and Tanya Plibersek have never forgiven him. That's what Christopher Dawes said. Well, in my view, neither will the rest of Australia forgive him, because there is virtually no case for the re-election of the Albanese government if the criteria is whether Australians are better off than before they came to office. In fact, the only people better off under the Albanese government are the Palestinians given visas to settle here from Hamas-controlled Gaza.